what I was thinking was, after reading Howard Zinn in college, I had always wondered why that book wasn't assigned in high school. And it wasn't assigned to me in college. I had to go out and buy it and learn about it to really understand American history and who we are as a people. And I honestly feel like moving forward, your book should be in public school curriculum. It really needs to be. And as a big picture, I want to kind of start off big picture and then hone in. You write that American Rule is the story of how a myth constructed an empire and led to its downfall. What is that myth?
Well, first of all, thank you. That means a lot. I felt the same way about a people's history of the United States, and I have to tell you that I found it at a really important moment in my life. Especially when I first read it was back in 2003 in the lead up to the Iraq War, and I felt very much orphaned at that time. You know what I mean? I felt very much like there was something wrong about the way that the country was working and the fact that we were running headlong into this obviously immoral and illegal war. And that book, that book created a foundation of understanding for me that I'm still trying to understand for myself. American Rule is part of that. And what I eventually came to understand is, and yeah, you have to think, like, I was covering the election in 2016. And, I've studied politics and I've studied history for years and years and years. And the election in 2016 and the emergence of Donald Trump spoke to me that there was something about America that I didn't understand, that there was some sort of facet to our reality that didn't work the way that I had thought that it did, like months before this whole thing became a thing. And back in 2016, I was warning a lot of people because I was going into these Trump rallies and, talking to the people there and hearing what they had to say. And, a lot of anti-democratic things, a lot of violent things, a lot of racist things that they were talking about. And I realized afterward that I needed to go back to the very beginning of this subject and sort of unwind American history and sort of relearn it for myself to understand, like, where did it go wrong? And what I ended up finding out was that it's not that something went wrong necessarily, it's that the way this country has worked from the very beginning is completely the opposite of what I thought. And the reason it's the opposite of what I thought is because I and a lot of people that I know and a lot of Americans were raised up within this mythology of American exceptionalism. This idea that America is ordained by some sort of, whether you want to believe it's like a Christian God or some sort of almighty, omnipotent, being, or even the universe, even if we're just carrying out the will of the universe. That myth was used from the very beginning in this country to paper over a lot of terrible mistakes, terrible treatment, and manipulations that, of course, ran counter to our espoused principles. So what I discovered in this work was that from the very, very beginning, this was a weaponized mythology, and that it has continually been used and refined and focused in order to exacerbate profit and power of the already wealthy and powerful.
Yeah. You open the book by writing that you were part of the cult of the shining city, which was white identity evangelicalism rooted in the myth of American exceptionalism. And you note that this identity has all but broken our politics. So when did you first recognize that you were raised in a cult?
Well, so the whole idea, when I call it the cult of the shining city, I just want people to understand that this is not a group that is like, we are the cult of the shining city. This is a certain type of white identity evangelicalism that is taking control of the American right. And I grew up in it, and it's one of those things where it's like, the allegory of like Plato's cave. You're in a cave, you don't know you're in a cave. You have absolutely no idea that the reality that you've been raised up in and has formed your worldview, there's something wrong with it, right? There's something off because it's the only thing that you've ever known. I felt very weird about my evangelical community and teachings at a very, very young age. They were steeped in not just like very, very quiet, barely papered over racism, but constant conspiracy theories. And not just like the, like an Alex Jones type of conspiracy theories, although for sure that was part of it, but also supernatural conspiracy theories. The idea that there were enemies of America who happened to be in league with Satan and things like that. I grew up with that thinking that that was reality. And I eventually left the church and that community behind. And it wasn't until I started doing research for American Rule that I started to understand exactly why that reality was the way that it was. And that's because so much of American evangelicalism is rooted in the Christianity of the Confederacy, which is not something that we're taught about. It's not, we basically, when we talk about the Civil War, we talk about how great the generals were, like, how great their troop movements were. And the reason is because to look at the Confederate States of America and what it was and what it actually embodied is a damning indictment of American culture, American religion, and American history and society. So it wasn't until I actually started working on this book that I actually was able to put two and two together and understand why I was so uncomfortable with the way that I was raised and why I was so uncomfortable with my place in the world back then.
Talking about the founding myth, I want to kind of start there. And you mentioned conspiracy theories, which is really my focus right now. Especially, I want to build into QAnon and where we are now. But
I tell you, you cannot understand modern America without understanding conspiracy theories. You just can't.
Yeah, I also, my parallel work life is in fitness, and I've worked as a fitness instructor for a long time. And I always try to get across in my writings on health and fitness that our habits today, you can't really understand how we are, what we are, without looking at evolutionary biology and the conditions that used to exist that created us as an animal. And I feel the same way about society without understanding history and our place in it. And what you write about is that, I mean, from day one, James Madison's goal was to protect wealthy landowners, for example. And you talk about how the founding fathers were extremely elitist. Their view was not democracy for all. It was all only for a certain amount of people. And it makes me wonder, and I know this will be a contentious question in some ways, but do you think there should be a basic literacy test for voting, or something we have to, like a driver's license, that we need to at least understand something before we can get to the ballot box?
Well, so the problem with that is anytime you want to talk about like a literacy test or some sort of information test, obviously the first thing that ends up happening is it's used as a weapon against,
That's
vulnerable populations.
yes.
What I would say is this. I would say that not only is our educational system woefully underfunded, but it has been under constant, constant attack for generations, right? So what I would argue is this. I would argue that for instance, you brought up the framing of the Constitution, right? I thought I understood it. I had no clue, right? Like I went, so, I wrote about it in the book. I was like, this sounds so ignorant now that I've written this book. I didn't understand that there was so much time in between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. I didn't understand the events that led up to the Constitution. I didn't understand that James Madison did not have authority to write a constitution. Like, and many people consider it a coup. And he even admitted at some point, he was like, yeah, if it's a coup, but it's a good coup, which is just mind blowing. And if you, and it's funny, you brought up like the elitism of the founding fathers. I had never even thought about reading James Madison's notes about the Constitutional Convention. And they're there. I mean, you can go on, Amazon or Bookshop or whatever today and go order it. And what you find is just a verbatim, like a readout of how elitist and how racist the founding fathers actually were, and how they created this system because they didn't trust common people, right? Because they thought the common people would totally ruin the country, and the only people who should really have any power were white, wealthy, and powerful men. So one of the things that I would say is, I think instead of sort of something at the ballot box, what I would say is that one of the main issues that we need to have right now, besides of course stemming off conspiracy theories and the rise of fascism, is that we have to start fighting a battle to not just reinvigorate education, but to save education from these people who have used it as a weapon for generations now. I mean, there's absolutely no reason why we don't, as Americans, understand how the country was founded, except for the fact that we're hiding something that was unseemly and was a basis of control. And I think we have to look at it through that lens, which is we have so many battles that have to be fought right now to even like try and get this country on the right track. And one of the big ones has to be how we deal with our history and how we deal with education. So I would hope that we would be able to save something through education, and a lot of the other problems downstream would start to get better as a result of that.
One of the things we talked about last week on our podcast was the fact that a lot of environmentally minded wellness people should be celebrating the fact that carbon emissions are down due to lockdown because they had created this platform of saving the earth, and yet they're anti-mask, they're anti the COVID is a hoax, all of these things. And it's like the message was good until it impinged upon their daily life. And I also think about Bill Maher on Friday had said in a show, he had pointed to a study where he said that something like 80% of American adults now have a newfound appreciation for teachers, because now they have to play the role of teacher as well as everything else going on. And I wonder if something like this could actually help education along, in your view on that.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up in terms of that community, because weirdly enough, I didn't expect to talk about this today, but I've been researching a lot about QAnon has made these inroads in really unexpected places, and like fitness communities is one of them, and living spheres, and sort of alternative thought or new age thinking spheres. Like there's all these weird communities that it's starting to like seep into. And I think one of the reasons, and this goes back to the idea of the teacher thing. So one of the reasons I wrote American Rule in the first place, because there was a moment when I started writing it where I was like, this thing's too big. I don't really know what to do with this. Like I actually had to sit with it for a while and realize I sort of had to roll back my own identity and my own place in this country and start to understand that so many of the things that I thought about my identity and the things that I believed were based on faulty premises, right? So one of the reasons I think that conspiracy theories are making these inroads is because the myth of American exceptionalism that I'm trying to deconstruct, it creates a dichotomy, right? It creates a situation where, okay, so if America is this special nation, if there's something inherently special about America, well, then how are we failing right now, right? Like, how are we faltering as a country? And by the way, the coronavirus has just totally brought to the surface so many American problems that we could ignore. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
and I'm not even just talking about inequality and race. I'm talking about our healthcare system. I'm talking about our infrastructure. I'm talking about our shared sense of reality, if there ever was one, right? So all of a sudden, it creates this vacuum, which is, okay, America is a special nation. Well, why is it faltering? Within the myth of American exceptionalism, there's only one solution, which is, well, we're being sabotaged from beyond and within, right? There's something that is happening right now. There's an attack on us, and people are attacking us. And by the way, to borrow something from like the Bush years, they're attacking us because they love our freedom, which is just an incredible lie, right? But when you actually start looking at history, what you start finding out is that conspiracy theories, particularly nationalistic conspiracy theories, are what happen when a country's mythology starts to wane a little bit, right? When all of a sudden this country that's supposed to be very, very powerful starts to decline. And so what you end up finding is that we have to step outside of the paradigm of exceptionalism. And when we do, there are so many more explanations for why things have happened, like that are based on fact, that they're based on like real events and actual reality, right? The alternative is to stay steeped in that reality and have no other choice besides to start embracing things like the deep state or QAnon or all of those things. So I completely agree. I actually think that teachers right now, I mean, on top of the fact that we don't appreciate teachers and we don't pay them and we constantly attack them because they hold keys to dismantling a system of mythology and civic religion, right? We have to listen to them. We have to start listening to experts and people who understand this stuff and stop rejecting them because they happen to like rub up against the idea of exceptionalism. And I think that's exactly true. I think the teachers are the heroes that we need right now. And the fact that they have been under attack for so long should tell you everything you need to know about what powerful people think is dangerous to their power.
I always think about the time of American anti-intellectualism in the 60s where it started, but you can trace it throughout our founding and find anti-intellectualist movements. But you write specifically about our fascination with pseudoscience, pointing to eugenics and the mound builders, for example, as an example of times in the past where we've just gone off the rails. So as crazy as QAnon is right now, there has been plenty of precedent for it. And
can I explain the mound builder thing real fast?
Oh
Because
yeah.
it is one of the craziest things I've ever come across in my research. And
yes.
Listen, there were a few moments in this book where I had to walk away from it, like go for like a long walk in the neighborhood. And the mound builder thing was one of them. So, we have Andrew Jackson, who's a total genocidal madman, right? And Andrew Jackson is really interested in taking Native American land because there's a lot of money to be made. There's a lot of territory to be distributed, right? So it's all about getting rid of them. So like, his wealthy Southern base can get hold of that land, right? So suddenly him and all of the other white supremacists in the country start believing in this myth of the mound builders, which has been completely debunked. And by the way, the first debunker of that was Thomas Jefferson, which is kind of funny if you think about it. And this whole idea is that there were these structures in North America which were built by ancient Native American people. But white people were so elitist that they were like, oh, there's no way Native people built these. Obviously, there were white people in America before them, and they killed them and slaughtered them. And because they killed them and slaughtered them, this fictional, mythical, white race, then that meant that anything we did to them, including genocide and systematic oppression and destruction, was obviously okay, right? Which is the conspiracy theory mindset. The entire idea behind this, and it's been from the very beginning, is, you know what? These other people, if we give them a chance, and tell me if this sounds familiar in 2020 AD, right? If we give them a chance, they'll hurt us, right? They are conspiring to hurt us, and so I tell you what, we need to hurt them first. Mm-hmm. And that is always what leads to fascistic behavior, is this mindset that's like, no, they are coming for us, and so we have to go for them first. So the mound builder, I kind of went colorblind for a couple of days and just walked around in a haze. I was like, I cannot. He mentioned it in the State of the Union, Derek. Like, I was so shocked. It showed up in the State of the Union.
It would be interesting matching that against our last State of the Union. Well, and that's one thing. I mean, and this is, again, the importance of history, because history is long, our memories are short, and we have to understand, there's so many repetitions you bring out in this book that you're seeing where it originated from. For example, you brought up Andrew Jackson there, and he completely disregarded a Supreme Court ruling for the Cherokee Nation for recognizing them, and then just plowed ahead with a genocide, as you just mentioned. But he remains on our $20 bill. He was supposed to be off this year, but he's not. And I do wonder what kind of means or methods do we need to actually, in this fractured environment right now, actually teach people history? Do you see a light at the end of this road for that?
Well, okay, so there's good news and there's bad news. The bad news, first and foremost, is I hate to bring this down on a Sunday afternoon, or on a sunny afternoon, I should say. We are on the brink of total sectarian violence and civil war. We just are. I mean, if you actually look back at how the Civil War occurred, the conditions are pretty similar, right? I talk about that in American Rule. This idea of the mythology of us versus them and its constant sectarian warfare. The good news is this, and I think this is the hope at the end of the day. The truth is that mythology that we're talking about, that weaponized history, Yes. Does it play upon people's worst instincts? Does it play upon things like tribalism and polarization? Absolutely it does. And there's like a deep evolutionary part of us that, is very susceptible to this stuff, right? But here's the truth. When you actually start casting light on it, and by the way, we're not talking about Democrat, Republican, left, right, red, blue, any of these made up social constructs, right? What we're actually talking about is the use of power and oppression. If you look at it and you're not like trying to vote on a president or something like that, you suddenly realize that this weaponized history is meant to divide us in order to keep us from having more power and more wealth and more influence. It's actually used as a political cudgel. And the problem is that even the people who are holding on to it now the most, particularly supporters of Donald Trump, he's feeding them weaponized nostalgia, right? This old mythology. He's saying you do not need to examine the truth, right? This old myth is completely fine. There's nothing wrong with it. It's perfect. Everyone after it, of course, is part of a conspiracy. Those people are going to suffer because they don't want to deny that it's mythology, right? They actually are going to make less money. They're going to have less influence over politics. Their towns are going to continue to fall in disrepair. Everybody stands to benefit by disabusing themselves of these lies and these myths. That's the hope, is if we can actually move beyond them, maybe we can find a place where we can find some solidarity, or at least the beginning of a shared reality that looks like an actual reality, and we can start to actually fight back against this stuff. But that's the good news, is that truth is actually bipartisan.
Mm. What does a civil war look like in our era?
It would probably be an asymmetrical sort of a situation that looks a lot like what we have now, which would be a cycle of violence. All you have to imagine is the knob turned up a couple of degrees. Like, we've already seen the American right sort of, not sort of embrace. They've embraced a vigilante in the street who's, killed two people, maimed another. It would be a cycle of violence, like going into Portland and carrying out an extra legal killing of a member of so-called Antifa. And it would turn into a pretty chaotic situation. And I think that we, unfortunately, because of our weaponized history, the only thing that we can really imagine is like two big giant armies gathering out in a clearing somewhere with drums and flags and bugles or whatever. But what it would actually look like more is sort of an asymmetrical escalation between a lot of different people. You would probably see parts of America start to drift away from one another. You would see autonomous zones. You would see probably a heightening of rhetoric that would even make what we see right now make it seem almost quaint. And it's very fascistic and murderous right now, but it would be turned up.
Well, and that's you. One thing you bring about in the book at a number of points is eugenics, and
Yeah.
the fact that America was really what gave Hitler a lot of his ideas. I mean, the Philip Roth series in the book did that well recently, but you really nailed down specific instances where Hitler was influenced by this ideology. And I wonder, a friend just told me this, so I have to fact check before, but he said that Trump is hiring lawyers right now, getting ready to contest the election on all 50 states, which totally sounds, of course, but I will make sure that's true. But we know we're entering it. Like, I feel like we've just had an appetizer in 2020 for what's about to happen. If he does get a second term, do you think that anything is off the table in terms of sorts of oppression on specific peoples in this country?
Well, I'll go ahead and I'll start with the link between America and the Third Reich, which is something that I assume you probably didn't learn about this in the classroom. I didn't learn about this in the
No.
classroom, because of course the weaponized mythology is that America went into World War II and we were the good guys and we knocked fascism out and it went away and that was the end of it. The truth is that America and Germany were caught up in something called the Romantic period in the 19th century. That also has a lot to do with, of course, the genocide of the Native American people, Manifest Destiny, which we were always taught was about settlers going out and conquering the West, right? Well, no, it was about white people conquering a continent. And the people at the time said as much. It was about white supremacy taking over the country. Well, Germany had its own movement of that as well. So we were linked philosophically through the Romantic movement, which was all about sort of the exaltation of ethnic groups, right? And this goes back to the medieval time period where after the fall of Rome, you know, you have all these ethnic groups trying to start countries and start up their own culture. Well, eventually, when you get into the 20th century, I mean, our eugenics program was standard. I mean, they took our laws, took them over to Germany. They took a bunch of eugenics experts they from America over to Germany. They helped Germany set up their own eugenics programs, and they were welcomed like heroes. They were given medals. They were given banquets. You know, they met with all of the major Nazi leaders. Then on top of it, this idea of white supremacy being under attack, which is the underpinnings of fascism, that came mostly from American writers and thinkers who not only were bestsellers in America, but they advised presidents, they advised Congress, and then they would go over to Germany and they would be treated like heroes and given, you know, banquets and meet with Hitler and all these people. So and by the way, the Philip Roth thing was really important because it brought up the fact that America had a burgeoning fascistic movement
Mm.
until Pearl Harbor. There were a lot of fascist groups in this country, including American Nazis. And, you know, we have an American hero, Charles Lindbergh, who's remembered for his feats of heroism. But he like was published in, what was it? The weekly, no man, it was like one of those things that my grandma used to get. It was I'll think about it in a second. It was like one of those you know, little books, Reader's Digest.
Reader's
That's what
Digest.
it was. So he was even published in Reader's Digest saying we need to form an alliance with Hitler to save the white race from, you know, hordes of people of color or whatever. Well, we've thrown that away. We don't pay attention to it anymore. And so as a result, we think that fascism is a purely like, you know, aberration of 20th century Western Europe, right? It's something that we couldn't possibly have here. Here's the problem that we have. I don't even know that Donald Trump could explain to you what fascism is. I think if you asked him the question, what is fascism? Like he would say something about Germany or whatever. He's intuitively an authoritarian. And the reason that he's an authoritarian is because he is combined of a lot of different traits. So like on one thing, he is narcissistic in his worldview. And if you don't agree with him, he will make you agree with him based on force, or he will eliminate you, right? These are things that he intuitively does. And they run across, these authoritarians, they run across democratic institutions and they find where they're weakest. I always like to tell people it's like the velociraptors in Jurassic Park, right? There's like the electrified fence and they try and find where the electricity isn't. And when they find holes, they burst through it. And that's the problem, is that American democratic institutions have been whittled away for decades now, intentionally. And it's been done for power and profit. And now Donald Trump is just knocking those fences over left and right. So I always tell people, I don't know that Donald Trump would necessarily want to be a dictator. Like, I don't think he wakes up in the morning and is like, this is the plan, but he naturally does it. And he's surrounded by people who see the advantage of having a person like that in power that they can form alliances with, right? So what could happen in a second term, particularly if he steals an election, if he doesn't, you know, pay attention to, you know, what the results are? The big call this morning before we got on here is there's a bunch of really, really wild-eyed conservatives calling for the Insurrection Act to be used on election day, which I've been trying to warn people that there's a real possibility we're going to see paramilitary groups at the polls. There's a possibility we might see federal troops in certain places. I mean, everything is on the board because, and by the way, I know everyone's like, oh my God, this is America. It can't happen here. It happens a lot of places, and it can happen here.
Yeah.
But if he gets another term, there's very little to believe that things won't be off the table. And I will throw this out there, and again, not to get too dark here, but it's true. We have a crisis right now, particularly on the West Coast, where climate change has just wreaked unbelievable havoc. I want people to think about how we've treated immigrants and refugees on the border of America, right? We put them in cages, we've separated them, we treated them with great cruelty, we've done an intentional cruelty, by the way. It was a strategy to say, if you come to America, quote unquote, illegally, we will harm you, right? I want you to imagine, after seeing that, what will happen if more climate catastrophes occur, and they will. Then if more climate catastrophes occur, then why would you believe that things wouldn't get worse? Why would we treat these people with human dignity? Why would we treat them with kindness? Why would we welcome them? So we need to understand that when we're voting in November, we're also voting for what happens post 2020. We're voting for what happens, in these coming disasters, because, experts tell you they're right there. And not only right there, they're happening right now, right? But they're going to get worse, and how we deal with them is going to be it's going to be managed directly by what we do in this election.
I hear you. My wife and I have been coughing all week. I mean, we're in Los Angeles, so we're not even that close to the fires, but the smog here is the worst it's been in 30 years because of that. And it's been affecting our health here. So I can only imagine. And the fact that we don't band together. This episode of Conspirituality, the podcast, will be also partly talking about 9/11. I was in one of the towers less than an hour before a plane hit. I was there that day. I mean, I'm from New Jersey and I lived in New York. And the one thing I always will remember was, for those couple of months in New York, something you don't do in New York, which is you look at everyone in the eye and you say hello during the course of your day. That lasted for months. But what was so fascinating was all of the conspiratorial thinking was predominantly from people who weren't there and didn't live there. And there are two things that I picked out from your book that are very current, but they have older roots, which is former New York Senator Roscoe Conkling in 1882 saying corporations are people. And then in 1893, this blew my mind. The fact that J.P. Morgan loaned the U.S. government $65 million, or else the country would have went under. And the question I'm getting at here is there a possibility that as a nation we band together to understand that the vested interests are the real problem, and that all of us, the 99%, however you want to phrase it, are really the ones suffering? And why aren't we putting our focus and efforts at what the real problem is?
Well, so let's go back to history, right? So I was raised by the way, real fast, I'm so glad that you weren't there. I'm so glad that you're here talking with me today. That makes me very happy that you are. So that's good. I was raised by survivors of the Great Depression, right? I was raised by grandparents who I mean, my grandmother was thrown out of the same house like 3 times in one day. They barely ate. They were emaciated for months at a time. And even that, they taught me about the Great Depression. They taught me about American politics and American society around the Great Depression. But even they didn't prepare me to understand that these market crashes were a pretty semi-regular occurrence. Like, if you actually look at the American stock market, like it just accelerates and accelerates and accelerates, and then like self implodes, and then all of a sudden every American is just like, what the hell, we're in trouble here, right? And it has like a really negative effect on your life. And I mean, not only does it like cost you your job, it actually takes years off your life. It worsens your ability to live your life. It leads to unbelievable social suffering, all these things. The fact that that isn't something that we study, that our stock market and our economy are inherently not just rigged against us, but that they are constructed to not be stable, right? This entire system is constructed to sort of like explode like a bomb, and then you pick up the pieces afterwards and you do it again. It's these boom and bust periods. The fact that we're not taught that is a major problem, right? That the cycles of American history show us. It's what's the old thing? It's like history rhymes, right? If you want to understand America in 2020, you have to understand the Gilded Age. You have to understand that all of these, so-called robber barons, who, by the way, have been held up for years and years as heroes and titans of American industry. Well, you need to understand that these people not only controlled monopolies, they monopolized American politics. They bought and sold politicians left and right and in the open. And as a result, the American government didn't serve the American people. And do you know what happened to the American people? No, they lived in squalor. You know, it was like these people literally, and this is a really sad thing, but it's true. You know, we don't have child labor now in America. We don't necessarily have, you know, people in tenement houses or whatever. And by the way, some places we do. Like we have people squatting in like old derelict hotels and stuff, right? But if you actually go around the world, those same companies are doing it to other people, right? Where they have child labor, they have slave labor, they have sweatshops, they have all this stuff. So what we need to understand from like the robber baron age is that the only reason that they don't have all those things here right now is because they haven't got there yet, right? They're not going to stop it. And they're exploiting people over here who are much, much cheaper, and they're going to drive down labor and all this stuff. When we start actually piecing that stuff together, we start to understand, oh, that's why that's happening. That's why that's happening. And when we can start, you know, connecting those dots, we actually understand this is the important thing. To understand where we are and where we're going, we have to understand where we've been. But that antiseptic, weaponized history that I was talking about keeps us from doing that. It keeps us in that cave that I was talking about. And it keeps us guessing at why things could possibly happen. And that's where these conspiracy theories show up. They come into the vacuum of real information. And all of a sudden we start wondering why people do the things they do and why this system is rigged against us. And the only thing we have is, you know, superstition and, you know, paranoia. But if we have actual information, we can arm ourselves with it and we can start to make a difference.
My wife came home from the co-op yesterday. She occasionally brings home a new soda she's trying. I don't really drink soda, but it was called Leninade, Lenin. And it's by a Russian company who's using their platform as this lemonade manufacturer. And, you know, Lenin's not Stalin, but he has a pretty sordid history. And I'm like, what if you saw Hitler aid in the shelves there? And again, it brings up that distance question. And I feel like the way that, you know, the Washington Post is what tracked 22,000 lies that Trump is, it's just, we've come to expect that at this point. So you see something and now it's like, yeah, what else do you expect? How do we regain a sense of empathy? Do we have any historical precedent for coming out of this cult in any capacity?
Well, I'm really glad actually that you brought up the Soviet Union, because one thing that you have to understand, and again, I don't think you can understand modern America without understanding the Cold War through a better lens, right? So we like to hold up in our mythologized history that we won the Cold War and, you know, we vanquished this enemy. No, we dealt each other mortal blows. It just so happens that the Soviet Union went down and we're still bleeding internally, right? Like we're sort of staggering away from the Cold War. But if you actually look at what happened in the Soviet Union, it actually reflects a lot of what's happening in America right now. There came a moment in the Soviet where they became, as a people and a culture, incredibly depressed and incredibly oppressed, right? And it reached a point where they knew that the Communist Party and that their leaders and officials were lying to them. They knew it. They were incredibly aware that they were being lied to. But it was just met with a big shrug. Well, what do you do about it, right? And eventually that apathy and powerlessness breeds more apathy and powerlessness. I keep trying to tell people, so like for instance, one of the more frustrating things in the past couple of weeks was when it came out that Bob Woodward had Trump on tape saying that he knew the coronavirus was deadly, and Woodward sat on it for 7 months. Right, as more and more Americans died, and as Trump constantly lied and completely flooded the the zone with all of this misinformation and disinformation, and I was like, okay, listen, would it have helped? I don't know, but you have an ethical obligation to try. And everyone's like, well, what's it matter? Trump lies and nobody cares. And it's like that is the perfect recipe for an authoritarian society. When all of a sudden you have a leader who lies, obviously, and everyone shrugs and says, well, who's going to do anything about it? We have to resist that. We have, because one of the problems, and this has to do with the mythologized history of America. When you actually look at American history, you realize that power is a pendulum. It goes from the state and the wealthy and the elite holding almost all of the cards, and Americans feeling powerless and powerlessness and apathy, and then suddenly remembering, oh yeah, we have power. Suddenly you start to realize that's like the social contract. And if we come together and we find solidarity and we find organization, we can like move mountains, right?
Yeah.
So the entire point is that modern politics is built around the idea of spectacle. It's something we watch on the TV. It's like a soap opera, right? With villains and heroes and messiahs and devils. And so we watch it, but my God, never think for a second that you could possibly do anything besides maybe vote once every 4 years, right? The truth of it is the answer to all of this is gathering together and healing that social atomization. We have to start remembering that my neighbor is my neighbor. This is a community. We do better when we're not, fighting the battles of like a Trump or a Gingrich or something like that. We do better when we realize that we can take care of each other and we're not engaged in a trench warfare, right? A zero-sum game against one another. So I truly believe that if we're going to beat this thing back, and we have to, because it's the pendulum at this point is very, very tilted towards the wealthy and the powerful, but it's also assisted by things like expedited technology, right? Like if you want to know what could possibly happen, look at Putin's Russia, look at China, look at what happens with what their technology affords those dictatorial powers, right? If we lose it now, the pendulum might not swing back simply because it's aided by things like the internet and surveillance and all of that.
Yeah.
But if we come together and we reform our common bonds and we work beyond this weaponized mythology and we find something real and human, there's definitely hope. But do not mistake me. We're on the precipice of something really, really great or something really, really terrible. And people need to get some skin in the game and realize that we gotta push it in the right direction.
A few weeks ago, I talked to a technology specialist, Imran Ahmed, who runs the Center for Countering Digital Hate in the UK. And he did a huge report on the anti-vax movement and how Facebook, predominantly Facebook, but also Instagram and YouTube, have made almost $1 billion off of anti-vaccination propaganda. And his argument was that the best and most effective way is deplatforming. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on deplatforming to help to combat some of these conspiracy theories.
Well, so here's the big problem here. And again, I didn't realize this until I wrote American Rule. Like before I wrote this, I definitely saw the world through like the left-right paradigm, right? The Republican, Democrat, who did this, who did that, who's in the right, who's in the whatever. What you come to realize when you actually look at history is you realize that at a certain point, that left, right, red, blue, Democrat, Republican paradigm, at some point you rise above it and you sort of look down on it, right? Like, so for instance, I always say that people like Donald Trump or Putin or Mark Zuckerberg or Bezos or something like that, they're actually what I would call post-political, right? They're people who they're not really left or right. They're just whatever gets past, impediment of profit and power, right? They would much rather get past the point of democratic representation, which is one of the main projects of all of these people. It's something that they share. But if you look at somebody like a Mark Zuckerberg, Facebook has turned into one of the biggest weapons of the extreme right around the world, right? It is not only disinformation and conspiracy theories, but it's organization and radicalization. Mark Zuckerberg is not an extreme right-wing person. He's not left-wing either. He's none of it. He has a customer. And where he's making the most money, if you actually look at the biggest post on Facebook every day, like the top 20, I want to say, are far-right extremist and conspiracy theorists. He's not doing it because he's pushing an agenda. He's doing it because that's where the money's coming from. If it was the left that was doing it, it would make a giant difference, right? So then the question is this. When will we get to the point where people like a Zuckerberg or a Bezos or any of these people, will they start to recognize that what they're doing is corrosive to society? Well, we reached that in 2016, right? When we realized what they did to the election and how that entire thing occurred. Well, all they've done since then, like every other corporate CEO and corporate PR team, is they've said the right things, but then they don't do anything, right? It's just a smokescreen. It's just a bunch of publicity memos and lies that they don't really stand behind. I don't know if deplatforming can happen when these people know where the money comes from. Do you know what I mean? Like when they know where their meal ticket is made, I don't think that we can trust them. And that's one of the reasons, and going back to this idea of how the economy works and how our businesses work, we have to protect those people from themselves. It's one of the reasons why we need anti-monopoly crusades. It's one of the reasons why we need to take government back for the people, which is something that you see, again, after the robber baron age. People start realizing that they need to organize and take back the machinery of government and the economy for themselves. And when they do that, they start reining in these monopolies, right? And they start gaining power back from them. It wasn't complete before World War II happened, but it started, right? We have to save ourselves from these people, because the way the market works is it tells them to continue pushing this stuff. So deplatforming is one thing, but I also think that we have to tell people it's not okay to profit off of this. It needs to be met with societal shame and pressure. Like, it is not okay to continue down this road because it makes you money. And that also, by the way, that goes for our mainstream media. They're addicted to Donald Trump. They just are. They can't, he speaks their language. He gives them the things that they need. There's a reason why subscriptions are up, clicks are up, views are up, ratings are up. And he's honest about it. He tells everyone, he's like, they love me. They actually love me. And they do, because he creates a spectacle. And we have to wean them off of it. But the way that we do that, and it always goes back to this, we have to wean ourselves off of it. We have to say, we're rejecting this. We're not going to engage in this spectacle any longer, this palace intrigue, this tabloid journalism, whatever you want to call it. We need to tell them there's no money in it, there's no power in it, and we have to force them to make better decisions.
I don't know if you saw The Social Dilemma on Netflix yet.
Not yet. How is it?
It's excellent. I mean, all of this information has been out there, and since I work in media, a lot of the people, Roger McNamee and Jaron Lanier and Kathleen O'Neill, I've read all their books and they're fantastic. But what it does so well is it just puts it all together so you can see how it happened. And that's a really great documentary does that, like a great history book, right? It takes all these pieces and like, hey, this is how it formed it. So I highly recommend it. And I've seen a lot of people on social media say they're leaving social media. But, unfortunately, well, I mean, you don't know if it's a left-right thing, but I tend to run in more liberal circles personally. You used a term, weaponized nostalgia, which I'll probably steal because that's a great term. But you write about how Reagan had said, make America great again, which I knew, but I didn't know Bill Clinton said it too. And so we have this constant desire to return to a time that never really existed, right? That's the concept of utopia as a no place. And everything you're saying right now, we're talking about all this historical context and we're talking about making better decisions. What do you see, instead of making us great again, actually moving forward and making better sustainable choices? Do you think we can be proactive? Or is it going to be like climate change where we're just constantly putting out fires and not making decisions until we're forced to?
Well, one of the great misunderstood parts of modern American history is post Nixon. There's this moment, and it's characterized very much by Jimmy Carter's malaise speech, right? The idea that Americans don't feel powerful, or they feel like America has lost its way or whatever. Ronald Reagan was not the Ronald Reagan that everyone sees him as. He was an actor who came along and sold American revival. He came along and he was like, no, there's nothing wrong with America. We're perfect. We're God's chosen nation. He revived the idea of American exceptionalism. He did so well. He was so good at selling the denial of reality to Americans, because, I mean, that's a lot better than being like, eat your vegetables, right? That's a lot better than we have a lot of real problems that we need to face. It sounds a lot better to be like, no, don't worry about it. Buy stuff. It's fine. He did so well at that the Democratic Party, and Bill Clinton was a big part of this, the Democratic Party in the late 80s said, we will never win another election unless we become like the Republican Party. And so what ends up happening is that Reagan was so effective in selling the revivalism of the American exceptionalism and the American dream that the Democratic Party moved far right. And they started presenting what they called Republicanism or Reaganism with a human face, right? And you actually start to realize that in '92, Bill Clinton actually ran to the right of George H.W. Bush at times. Like, he actually basically claimed that he was the honest heir to Ronald Reagan. And by the way, like, that is just sort of the political reality that we've been living in. That's why, left or right, blue or red, every politician has to talk about the American dream. They have to talk about how good America is and what the potential is. You know, you have someone like a Barack Obama, right? Barack Obama gets asked who his favorite presidents are. I think the first president he always named was Ronald Reagan. But that doesn't work in our traditional left, right, Republican, Democrat paradigm, right? Because how could possibly he be a part of that? Because the Democratic Party moved right. We actually have argued for years about issues that don't need to be argued. Like this whole Black Lives Matter thing. It shouldn't be necessary. Black Lives Matter, right? It's not even something that we should have to argue about. We shouldn't have to argue about who uses bathrooms and which bathroom. It's such a crazy paradigm that actually has nothing to do with reality, right? So here's what I keep saying, because people have talked to me about the intent of American rule. And I say this, so I understand that this sounds provocative. I want to destroy the myth of American exceptionalism. I want to eradicate it. I want to implode it. And here's the reason why. I think it moors us to a fake reality, right? Because if we're actually going to talk about how to make America a decent country with decent humanity and basic human decency, we can't say, well, America's perfect. What do you intend to do? Right? Because then any reform that you ever talk about, it's like, well, why do you hate America? Which, you know, that sounds pretty familiar, right? Yeah. Well, why do you hate America? And then all of a sudden it's just used constantly as this sort of like cudgel. I think that once we disabuse ourselves of the myth of American exceptionalism and we start looking at American history and saying it's really problematic and very inspirational at other times, it allows us to build something new. I think we're actually at a moment of generational shift. And, you know, we have another presidential election where we have two boomers who are running for it, right? That they're still holding on to power. I mean, like, and they're both well in their 70s. We are at a place of generational shift. Most Americans understand that America is not perfect, that we're not the country that, you know, we thought we were post World War II. I think that if we disabuse ourselves of something, that old mythology, we can build something new. And I actually think it can invigorate us. I actually think it could give us a new sense of purpose, this idea of what do we want to be, as opposed to being chained to this concept of the past.
It fascinated me when you wrote about Jimmy Carter in the book and that speech, and the fact that he was probably he was a great example of Christian values, and the Christians weren't interested in actually living out those values.
Yeah, the Reagan. See, there's where the slip went, right? Isn't that amazing? You try to talk about Carter and Reagan just comes right in and blasts in. No, the funniest thing about this is, you know, everybody talks about like the evangelical right forming this relationship with Ronald Reagan. Well, Jimmy Carter was like not just an evangelical Christian, but he talked about it constantly. I mean, you know, he's been hospitalized God knows how many times in the last like 6 months, and he still teaches Sunday school every Sunday, you know? Yeah. And he is he's a really incredible figure if you look at him detached from what I call sort of the normalizing history. It's the type of thing that like CNN runs like 7 parts of, you know what I mean? And it just goes real fast, and it's like, then the Berlin Wall fell after Reagan told it to. And it's like, that's not what happened. Well, with Carter, and I would, for anybody who has like a spare amount of time, go and listen to the so-called malaise speech. It is a sobering, in the mirror and recognize where we go wrong, that we need to start sacrificing. We start to meet. It's an adult conversation. You know what I mean? It's like a really mature adult conversation, and it has just been crapped on for years as the absolute worst speech ever given by a president. And the reason is because nobody wanted to hear it. They wanted to be told that America was perfect and wonderful and chosen by God.
Yeah. One thing that fascinated me as well is that you really point out that at least 3 of the last 4 Republican presidents were not only unqualified, but pretty disinterested or uninterested in being president, at least in governing, right? The power they liked, but the governing. And I wonder if there's any possibility. I mean, I'm looking specifically at the Republican Party, but if we want to go past left and right, right before we started this conversation, the last tweet I saw was from Bloomberg saying that Donald Trump said he would do a 4-hour debate with Joe Biden if Joe Rogan moderated it. So that was just this morning, I guess. And I'm wondering, like, can we get past the cult of personality and actually be interested in people who want to do the boring work of governing again?
You know, I was thinking about this actually. I was talking with somebody about this last night. So, have you seen this documentary? It's like McMillions. It's about the McDonald's monopoly scandal.
No, I did not see. It's on my list, but I've not seen it yet.
Okay, it's not my favorite thing, but there's a documentary which, so there's this moment where it's like at a charity event or something like that, right? You have a bunch of McDonald's CEOs, which are a bunch of like white dudes in ties and suits, right? And then you have an actor dressed up like Ronald McDonald, right? And for the world, Ronald McDonald is like the head of McDonald's. You know what I mean? Like Ronald McDonald is the one who like calls the shots at McDonald's. That's what kids see, right? But this actor, you can tell as like this actor starts ad-libbing at this event, all the CEOs are like, oh my God, what's this clown gonna say? You know what I mean? Like, what's he gonna do? And suddenly I realized Donald Trump wants to be the mascot of America, right? He's not interested in actual legislation. He's not interested in the hard parts of the job. He actually hates the job. You can tell that he hates the job. What he enjoys is the ceremonial part of it and sort of the attention that comes from it. I tell people a lot that I think the perfect job for Donald Trump would be a post-president president, which is like a guy who goes into country clubs and people are like, hey, Mr. President. And he comes in and he says, you know, this is what I think about what's going on. And he BS's for a while and then he shuffles off and plays 18. I don't think he actually has any interest whatsoever in the hard part of politics, which is what we've been taught to do. If you actually, I'm glad you brought that up. If you actually go back to Ronald Reagan, he had no idea what was going on. And I'm not even talking about rumors of Alzheimer's or dementia. He literally was not interested in being president of the United States outside of the ceremonial part of it. Like he was given instructions by think tanks. He was given instructions by Republican politicians and strategists. They had to like create movies and cartoons to even tell him what was going on. He read his daily briefings like a script for Hollywood, right? We have been taught that the American president is supposed to be the mascot of America, and that's one of the reasons we have Donald Trump. But now we're seeing the damage of when that clown starts speaking outside of the script, right? When they start going into business for themselves and ad-libbing, all of a sudden the country falls into disrepair and ruin.
Yeah. I was amazed. I mean, I've known about the astrology connection with Reagan, but I didn't know Manly Hall was an influence, which kind of blew my mind that that's pretty out there stuff. I mean, you're talking theosophy at that point. You're going pretty deep into metaphysics at that point, and that's how the government was being run, or at least being influenced. That's out there.
Oh man, that was another one of those moments when I found that in the book. I had to go for a walk. You know, there were all these tabloid reports about Nancy Reagan obviously being into astrology, which, you know, whatever. But then all of a sudden, when you start actually peeling back the layers, you start realizing that like her astrologer was like being like consulted on like political matters, right? And there are reports even from Reagan's own chief of staff that she was being told confidential, like classified information in order to like figure out what Reagan was going to do and when he was going to do it. And then I started peeling back more layers. I was like, this is weird. And this shining city thing, which has actually become the slogan of the American right over the past few decades, right? Since Reagan, this idea that America is a shining city on the hill and we need to spread and become a leader of the world. You start to realize that Manly P. Hall, who, by the way, for people who don't know, spend some time reading up on Manly P. Hall. Yeah. Because this was a guy who went around California in this new age era, and he would give these sold out lectures. I mean, he was a huge superstar in like this new age Hollywood sort of circle, which is how, of course, Ronald Reagan came across him. And he would tell these stories about how America was a culmination of a divine plan that was carried out by secret societies of philosophers and heroes, and that they had all planned to create an America, which, by the way, in case you're wondering if Atlantis shows up in this story, Atlantis shows up in this story, right? And this is a person that gave Ronald Reagan not just his idea about what America was, but it gave him the slogan of the shining city on the hill. He truly believed that America was this occultish destination that was supposed to lead the world against some sort of like supernatural evil. And if you actually start breaking that down, you realize this idea of Reagan that we had, which is funny. You know, the right likes to portray Reagan as like this really, really Christian, God-fearing, conservative, fiscally conservative. No, he wasn't actually religious. He was spiritual, and he was really into the occult. He also like ran up incredible deficits. Incredible deficits. And was he for small government? Absolutely, he was not. He was for overreaching government.
Yeah.
So you start to realize the mythology of Reagan is completely the opposite of what has been sold. And that is one of those things that when you start breaking that down, modern American history starts falling apart based on conventional understanding.
So it's not actually that big of a step from Atlantis to the reptile people who are killing children right now.
It's a hop, skip, and a splash is what it is.
I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on QAnon and how we've got there and how we get out of this situation.
Well, I've been studying QAnon for a while. I was saying this last night. I, in the beginning when the QAnon thing first emerged, everyone sort of like, I would sort of talk to people about it, and I was like, you need to pay attention to these people. Mm-hmm. And everyone's just like, no, this is insane. Like, who cares if people think JFK Jr. faked his death or time travel or, secret astronauts or whatever. And I was like, no, there's something to this. Like, there's a cultish aspect to this. And on top of that, one of the things that has occurred, and I've been doing a lot of research lately on the history of Western civilization. And here's a quick little fact that knocked me back with this as well. So when the Christians were like a persecuted group in ancient Rome, right? They did their rituals like in the dark, in the catacombs and stuff, away from the public eye. So every Roman was so suspicious of the Christians. And what did they do? They said that they were sacrificing children, they were drinking their blood, they were abusing them for power, for supernatural power, whatever. So the Christians, when they gained power in Rome, they immediately started saying the same thing about Jewish people. And what you end up seeing is a cycle of there's all these conspiracy theories and myths and libels that always occur, and they never go away. They are constantly used to create a situation. It legitimizes fascistic behavior, right? So if a group is evil, if they are legitimately evil and that they are coming for you, again, you should attack them first. Right? You should go ahead and hurt them before they hurt you. So one of the things with QAnon that people need to get is that they are a legitimate threat. They've already carried out terrorist activities. They're already planning other terrorist activities. They're getting at least tacit approval from the American right. Eventually, they'll merge with the American right. Like, that's where this thing is going if we're not careful. Because you actually look at the history of the modern right, they merged with the Tea Party in 2010. They were either going to be overtaken by the Tea Party or merge with them. They merged with them. The QAnon crowd, they're either going to be overtaken by them or they will merge with them. They'll merge with them. What people need to know about QAnon is that it is the exact same conspiracy theory. It's the deep state, it's the New World Order, it's the protocols of the Elders of Zion, it's blood libel. It's the exact same story, and it brings people in for this reason and this reason alone. We are alienated and we feel powerless. And when we're alienated and feel powerless, we start looking for explanations of why we feel that way. QAnon gives them not only an alternate reality, it gives them an alternate reality where they feel powerful. Because you are a digital soldier. You can find truth by looking through this movie or clicking through that. You're always one click away from saving the world from evil forces. So it's a cult. And what I would say, I've been working with a lot of people lately who have been trying to bring QAnon members back from the brink. Here's the problem, and this also Trump supporters as well. Engage them as a person. Talk to them as a human being first. Don't go in and just immediately be like, hey, what you believe is false, and here's the reason why. You need to establish personal trust again. They need to remember that you're an honest broker and that you're acting in good faith. If you talk about QAnon, you talk about QAnon. If you want to know how this works, go and look at people who deprogram cult members. And it always has to do with do not directly attack them. Do not directly go after their beliefs. Reestablish trust and honest brokership, and then eventually you can try and make some headway.
Yeah. Yeah, we've had Steve Hassan on this podcast, who's a cult expert, and one of my podcast partners is studying to be a therapist. He was indoctrinated in 2 cults, and now he's helping to bring people out, and that's what he does. And it's a tricky situation. We actually, whenever, for example, one of the episodes I have a friend who's worked with foster children for many years, and she gave us a list of 10 organizations that do credible work helping trafficking victims. And we publish this, and a lot of people get a lot out of it and they know where to go. But we've also had QAnon people come on our feed and being like, this is all deep state stuff. That's not how you really help. And that's a very challenge. I mean, it's challenging in the moment, at least. And you think about the indoctrination process of getting people out. I actually think there's going to be a movement in psychiatry of helping, in psychotherapy of helping people deprogram from that.
Yeah, you saw that particularly like post 1960s, post 1970s, right? You actually see like a group of people. Everyone always says Manson. There were a lot more than Manson. There were a lot of commune type messiahs and commune type cult leaders, particularly. And I want to point out the parallels here. It was a time where people felt like politics was beyond their control, where politics was beyond their grasp. And so they start looking for that. But I will say that a large part of it, and it goes back to the 1960s, 1970s, and especially right now, it's a trench warfare mentality, right? So like, for instance, if I talk to a Trump supporter and I say something critical of Donald Trump, they don't support Donald Trump immediately. They say, well, what about Hillary Clinton? What about Barack Obama, right? And here's what I say to them. And this is one of the reasons why I want American rule to get in as many hands as possible. We need to stop the trench warfare tit for tat thing, right? So for instance, if somebody says to me, well, what about Hillary Clinton? And I'm like, I have problems with Hillary Clinton. She voted for the Iraq War. Like, she was like one of the main proponents for the Iraq War, There's like a ton of problems. Actually, you want to go back to the healthcare bill. It was like a pretty corporate thing that the Clinton administration was trying to do. It wasn't crazy liberal. It wasn't left wing. She's not some sort of icon of the left, right? There are problems. The Clinton Foundation is something that uses money around the world for political purposes and enjoys tax breaks. I have a problem with that. Right? So if I start talking about the problems that I have with Democrats, and I am not a registered Democrat, I gave up my my registration because I did all this research. I wish we had other options. And by the way, that doesn't mean I'm not going to break my hand voting for Joe Biden against Donald Trump, right? You have to live in a reality where it's not these two opposed opinions. And if I come out and I'm like, yeah, I have this problem with this, and they're like, well, what about Barack Obama? And I'm like, yeah, he continued on the forever wars. I mean, the drone strikes got worse and worse with Barack Obama. Like, I actually think he was a good president, but there were problems. I don't hold him up as some sort of faultless messiah. If I do that, then all of a sudden they're like, yeah, well, I do have some problems with Trump. And all of a sudden, what you start finding is you start having a conversation because you're changing the environment. It goes from a Trump versus Democrat fight into a, oh yeah, we're on this side and the powerful and the elite are over here. And all of a sudden that dichotomy changes, and you can start comparing notes and realizing that those conspiracy theories are just shorthand for a larger, more complicated explanation that we need to find together.
Mm. Yeah, I'm as big of a fan of Obama as many people, but during his 8 years, I went from being a registered Democrat to an independent for similar reasons, because I wanted more flexibility and not to give, and for the very reasons you express. As with any good writer, you end on a positive note, or at least an instructional note on what could happen. And you write, we need a new appreciation for experts, for education, for human experiences that go beyond the pursuit of power, profit and power, and emphasize humanity in all of its pluralistic forms. So we're going to finish big picture here, and we've touched upon a lot in this hour. But are there, like, taking that sentence, what do you think are the most pertinent things that people can do to help that happen?
Um, I think that there's a couple things. Like, obviously everyone always just says vote. Well, that's one thing, right? And again, I don't think citizenship comes down to going out and voting once every 4 years. We have to start taking an active role in not just government, but our communities and our lives. I think that we need to rebuild these atomized bonds. Like, if somebody's listening, wondering what to do, I'm not going to tell them to just go out and donate to a campaign. And not even the big giant campaigns that obviously have a ton of money and most of it's used for administrative stuff. I would say give to some food banks. I would say start forming organizations in your community. And I don't mean ones that are based on necessarily elections, although that's important too. Say hello to your neighbor. Call somebody you haven't talked to in forever. Start rebuilding the bonds of society and community. Start working within yourself to understand what you want. It's not enough for your goal in life to say to beat Donald Trump. Well, what do you want to do afterwards? Because I have to tell you, and I try and say this in every appearance I do, Donald Trump is a symptom. He's not the disease. A healthy, sane country could not have possibly elected Donald Trump president. This has been going on for a very long time. And there are 3 steps I think everybody should listen to. 1, get educated. Because if you don't understand what's going on, if you don't know the real history, if you don't know the real explanations, if you don't know what's happened, you are completely impotent to face anything, right? Number 2, get pissed off, because the wealthy and the powerful have absolutely used misinformation and manipulation to keep you from leading a better life and the people you love from leading a better life. They've been exploited, they've been used. They could have lived longer, happier, more fulfilling lives if they weren't manipulated. Number 3, get organized. Find other people that you can talk to, find other people you can depend on, vote, but also form community bonds, and also get involved in local elections. Go to the school board meeting, go to the city council. Make sure that, like, you're actually applying pressure in politics everywhere that you can.